Hi everyone, my name is Katrina Browning and I am the Deputy Director for Succeed Together's Montclair Literary Festival. And thank you all for joining us for this online version of the fourth annual festival. We've got a great lineup today, so I hope you can join us for all of the terrific events we have planned. It's not quite the festival we had thought we would bring to you in March, but it's going to be a great day. Plus we have some more events on Sunday, September 13th. So have a look at our calendar. Today, we wanted to talk about the festival, which benefits Succeed Together, which is a non-profit based here in Montclair, New Jersey, which provides free educational services to low-income children in Essex County. If you'd like to support the tutoring program and the enrichment classes that we provide, please click on the link in the chat to donate. Any amount is greatly appreciated and allows us to continue with our programming. And today's books from the talk that we're having can be purchased through Watchung Booksellers. There's a link at the bottom of your screen and you'll be able to go straight through and purchase Maisie and Leah's books. So we're thrilled today to welcome Peter Coyle, who's the director of the Montclair Public Library, and he will be speaking with Newark librarian Maisie Card about her electric family saga, These Ghosts Are Family, and about how being a librarian has impacted her as a writer. They are joined by Leah Price, founder and director of the Rutgers Initiative for the Book and author of What We Talk About When We Talk About Books. And I'll just bring Peter up so we can see him. Hi, Peter. Welcome, everybody.
Hi.
And I'll see you at the end.
Great, thanks. Hi, Maisie and Leah. How are you?
Great. Hi, how are you?
Doing well.
Happy to see you, Peter.
Yeah, thank you for joining us for this talk. I'm really excited to have both of you here. And I'm excited to talk about our topic with, we're book people, so I think this is kind of a perfect thing for us to all talk about. But we have a lot to talk about. I think when we talk about books, there's a large history of books and the importance of it. So let's dive right in. And Maisie, you're a first-time novelist. Your first novel just came out, These Ghosts Are Family. How did you decide to write a book? What about being an author interested you, and how did you start?
Actually, I wanted to be an author before I wanted to be a librarian. I decided I was going to be an author when I was in high school. So a lot of the decisions I made afterwards were based on that goal. So I after college, I actually ended up getting an MFA, and it was in my MFA program that I started writing the book. And then it sort of took me about over almost 12 years to finish it completely. So I became a librarian and I had a lot of different experiences in that time that colored the book.
Sure. Now, how has your being a librarian, how has that affected your writing? Did that influence the writing or the book at all?
I think when I first started writing the book, I was more focused on, I guess, complete fiction, not really thinking about how historical events affected the characters. But yeah, when I was in graduate school, I actually was training to be an archivist first. So yeah, I got more interested in primary sources, and I fell down a lot of research rabbit holes, and that kind of changed the course of the book, and it became a family saga. Before it was sort of just a short story collection about characters, living separate lives from each other, but then it became a family. And I think that, that was influenced by the research I was doing. I wanted it to be an intergenerational saga so I could incorporate a lot of the things I'd learned about Jamaican history.
Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about the research rabbit holes. Leah, I saw that you smiled and laughed when she said that. Is that something you've experienced when you're researching? Do you go through research rabbit holes as well?
To be honest, Peter, I miss going down research rabbit holes because at this moment when librarians are working harder than ever, but that work is less visible to patrons who are not gaining access or are only beginning to gain access to those actual physical spaces in which physical books are held. I miss the sense of serendipitous discovery that used to come and hopefully will come again when I'm walking through the stacks, rather than the more systematic, less serendipitous research project that happens online.
Sure, yeah, that's totally understandable. I find myself sometimes when I'm reading online, I end up, whether it's whatever, I end up clicking and I spend hours because you're always on something interesting. And I think that's the great thing about reading is it can lead you in so many different places. And I think that's one of the importance of reading is that it is such it's an opportunity to discover lots of things. But as we talk about writing, one of the old axioms is to write what you know. And Maisie, your book is I don't want to say autobiographical, but it draws on your family history and heritage, and there are things in there. When you said you were studying to be an archivist, there are certainly things in that book where you talk about archive and materials and things. And I won't give away. There's some things that in the book that I think are very fascinating. Knowing that was some of your training. How did your life and your family background and experience, how did that color your writing of this book?
I think at the time when I started writing, I was kind of reflecting because I immigrated to America when I was 5 from Jamaica. And over the years, my mother and I and my brother were the first people in our family, besides my grandfather, who was already here, to come. And so over the years, kind of all of her side of the family is either here or in England. So I was kind of reflecting on how kind of distant and fractured our family had become over the years, just because of immigration, but because of secrets that I kind of found out when I got older. So I didn't want to write specifically about my real family, but I kind of wrote this kind of parallel family, where I can explore some of the real emotions that I feel that I have and people in my family have, but through fictional kind of situations, but situations that are kind of typical, for the culture and the people of the economic circumstances that I come from. So I wanted to have real situations, but acted out by fictional characters.
Sure. And Leah, when you're writing, obviously you're not writing about your family, but how does your experience relate? How does that color when you're writing about books and literature? What is the background in your life that propels that desire?
When a scholar writes about the history of reading, as I do, that scholar is inevitably going to write about herself because scholars are readers. That's what we do. That's part of our job description. And so writing about the history of reading and the history of all the ways in which people have used books, not just for reading, but also for displaying on a wall, like that very beautiful bookshelf behind Maisie in the frame, or giving as gifts. Writing about all of those uses of books is, if I were to be honest, I would say a way to try to make sense of what reading has meant to me. Specifically, we've been talking about patterns of family migration. I moved around a lot as a child, and books in general and libraries in particular were a kind of anchor for me, because in every new town that I moved to, I would find the same Dewey Decimal classifications in the public library, and often I would find the same books in some of the same books in each town's library, so that even as the furniture around me, my own family's possessions, kept changing, when I went to the library, there was a kind of standard template that gave a sense of comfort and continuity. So that's about books, but it's also about the library as a civic institution.
Now, we talk a lot right now about reading and the internet and ebooks and audiobooks and downloadable things. And so reading is going to always be around. We're always going to have to read, whether it's email or text message or things. But the way in which we consume information and reading has changed. Do you think that is affecting how we interact in society? The idea of sitting down and reading a book is something that a lot of people, maybe aren't doing now, or maybe they are. What do you guys think about in terms of how society is reacting to those changes?
I'll jump in.
Yeah.
I would see the main difference as being less between print and electronic reading than between short form and long form reading. Sometimes when we beat ourselves up about spending too much time on screen, we tend to imagine that if we weren't scrolling through Instagram, we would be reading War and Peace. But if you look at the history of print production, most people were never reading War and Peace. Most of Tolstoy's contemporaries were reading short little newspaper snippets with funny, gossipy stories and local news, which bear more, although they were printed, you could say that they bear more resemblance to Facebook than to War and Peace. So I think that sometimes we set up we rig the comparison when we contrast an idealized version of reading print books with our real electronic practices. If we look at the actual everyday ways in which people used to use print, it doesn't look much better than our use of social media today.
I also think that the social media does add it's created this demand for immediacy. You have to respond quicker. I feel like I've had to get off Twitter since the pandemic started, just because there's this constant, you become obsessed with this constant need for information and the most up-to-date kind of information about what's happening now. And it starts to create this kind of general anxiety all the time, because something's coming and you're just waiting for it constantly. And I felt since the pandemic started, I've been reading more books, just to feel, like I'm taken out of the world. And I think that's something that other people that I've talked to have kind of been saying, that they've been reading more during this current situation, just to kind of remove themselves from the news feed.
Yeah. So let's talk a little about reading as an escape versus reading as reading for knowledge, right? So fiction versus nonfiction. We know that language acquisition is important. We know that if students aren't reading on what we consider grade level by third grade, that they're going to be not as successful in school and other things. How can families encourage children to read? We talk about the reluctant reader, and my kids aren't reading that much. I want them to sit down and read a book. Let's talk a little bit about how that is in society and what we can do. And is that necessarily a bad thing that the kids aren't reading books and they're reading on their screens? What do you guys think about that?
I think I don't know. I think it depends on grade level. I know when I was a middle school librarian, like the kids loved to read on their cell phones. You know, and it was bad because they were actually pirating books. They had all figured it out, but I showed them how to use, you know, like Overdrive, you know, and so they started using those too. But it was just very natural to them. But when I taught high school, and the school I was working at had actually bought all these ebooks, I couldn't get the kids to use them. Like they just weren't comfortable. So in just a few years, like I guess there's like a big generation gap, even though, you know, the kids were just a few years older. Yeah, so I think for younger kids, what I found when I was, because for a while I was a bookmobile librarian, I used to go to schools, and what I found when parents would come on the bookmobile, some of the parents would often ask, you know, can you read to my kids? Can you find somebody to read to my kids? You know, and I felt like they felt insecure, like they couldn't read. And I was like, it's okay, you know, you can read in Spanish if you're more comfortable. And I think sometimes, you know, people feel like reading is something that you left for like professionals or academics, and it's not like normalized for some people. So I think for parents, it's like they have to model the behavior that they want to instill in their kids. And yeah, it's great to bring the kids to the library and to listen to story time, but I think also the parents themselves have to get comfortable just reading at home and reading for their own pleasure so their kids can see that.
One of the worrying things that we've seen during the pandemic is that the gap between girls' pleasure reading and boys' pleasure reading, which has existed for the past 150 years or so, that gap is widening. So it seems as if, given a lot of unstructured time at home, girls are filling that time with reading and boys are not necessarily. And in some ways, this is a new phenomenon during the pandemic. In other ways, it seems like a very old phenomenon, because some of the Victorian advice books that I read when I was working on what we talk about when we talk about books advise girls to read because they say it's the one activity that you can do without messing up your clothes. So boys are free to go out and play in the mud, but girls, who are supposed to be prim and proper and make less laundry to do, are supposed to sit quietly with a book. So I guess one question that I would have for you both as librarians is whether you've found ways to address that kind of gendered gap, as well as the socioeconomic gaps that we all know about in rates of pleasure reading.
That's a very interesting and a great question. I think one of the issues, really the core issue, is the gendering, right, of reading, of what boys should do, what girls should do. And there has been there's some anthologies, you know, books for boys or stories for boys, and I think there's an assumption of what boys like to read versus what girls like to read. And I think it's a little bit of a social construct. But I think the key is just encouraging kids to read what they like. You know, it doesn't matter if your boy wants to read, you know, Pinkalicious or whatever. Like, I think you need to encourage your children to read whatever they want. And I think the fear of saying, oh, this is a boy book or this is a girl book, or even the assumption that, oh, girls want to read princess books. Well, maybe the girls want to read a book about trucks. You know, I think we categorize too early what children want to read and what they should read, and I think that's a discouragement. You know, and so I wonder if there's something we need to do more as a society to encourage that wide variety of reading.
I think also, you know, sometimes like school curriculums will devalue graphic novels. You know, when I was a school librarian, you know, it's like, I think at one school, the district superintendent wouldn't let me, like, she would change my book orders, like wouldn't let me order graphic novels or too much fiction. You know, so And then sometimes with like reading contests or summer reading, I know some places will say like, oh, graphic novels don't count. So if a kid comes to you with what they want to read and you kind of devalue that thing, it just turns them off from reading. So I think, just not really judging what it is they want to read, and kind of just celebrating any kind of reading.
And I think that also kind of goes into something else that a lot of schools, and it's well-meaning, this is a well-meaning thing. They have accelerated readers or levels readers, and children can only read within their level. And I sometimes think that does more of a disservice to the students than a service. Sure, it's to help them find a book that maybe they're comfortable reading, but I think sometimes it discourages kids from reading. So I think it's also important for us to keep in mind that we need to be more open, I think, to letting kids choose what they want to read, and not segregating to a certain section of the library for only first graders versus fourth graders or something. Because I do think that reading is a very individual thing. Everyone's at a different level. Everyone enjoys something different. So when you try and take that individuality away from it, I think that ruins some of the joy that comes from that self-discovery and that ability to find something that they enjoy.
Yeah, I think there's, not to add too much about this, but just I think also there's this like false assumption that if you take something away, that that kids will substitute by focusing elsewhere. Like if you make it so that school librarians can only order like 80% nonfiction and only 20% fiction, which was I think what I was told when I was a school librarian. It doesn't mean that kids are going to read more nonfiction. It's just books will just collect dust on the shelf, because kids will they'll read what they want or they just won't read.
Yeah, and it's interesting you mentioned the graphic novel, because as I'm thinking here, we've had graphic novels for many years, like before they were comics. Even we look at illuminated manuscripts from the medieval ages. There are funny pictures throughout all of those things, so the idea of an illustrated book that has funny pictures or stories is not new to this century. It's something I think we have, as humans, have been doing for a long time, and I think there's some value in that. I think there's lots of value in it. So let's talk about the importance of reading, right? So we talk about reading for fun. Why do we have books? Why are we still reading? Why are libraries still around? And I think this can kind of be a round robin conversation where, Leah, maybe you can talk a little bit about maybe the history of books and how libraries have evolved a little bit, and are we really different now than we were 300 years ago with how we treat reading?
I think one difference lies in precisely what you and Maisie have been talking about, Peter, which is a growing suspicion of images. The idea that a child starts with picture books, but if they're reading the right way, if they're growing up the right way, if they're becoming an adult, they grow out of caring about the pictures. And in part, this comes from a sort of Protestant fear of images, the idea that they're childish and inferior to the abstract word. And yet, if you look at even books for very young children, even picture books, I think they're often more sophisticated about the architecture of the book as an object than books for adults are. I've been thinking about this a lot during the pandemic because without childcare, I've been reading aloud a lot to my kid. And we've been reading books like, this is not a book, which is a book whose pages hinge open to reveal things like an old laptop or the mouth of a monster, so that the shape of the book, the fact that a book opens and closes like a door, is itself part of the meaning of the book. And when adult researchers like me encounter books online, we usually encounter them as a flat page image, as a page scan. This is what you encounter if you read an ebook. But looking at videos posted by children's librarians who are doing remote read-alouds during the pandemic, they're treating the book as a three-dimensional object. They're opening it, they're closing it. They're not just showing a single flat page image like this. So I think that one question that we've had about books for the past few centuries is, how far should we care about the book as something that you look at and touch and smell, which is what babies do with books? And how far are we all supposed to grow out of that into a very abstract relation to ideas, which a book is just a convenient bucket to ferry from the mind of an author to the mind of a reader? So in that sense, maybe we shouldn't be trying to get children to read at a higher grade level, meaning books with fewer pictures. Maybe adults should be learning to read more like children.
You in your book, I'm trying to find it here. You play with the format of the book in the section called Interleave, I think, where rather than the words being on each page, it goes all the way across. And I found that very fascinating, especially as you're talking about the book as, you play with the format even in your book. And I wonder if as we talk about format, like we talk about ebooks and hearing things in audiobooks, if really our senses are not, it's not just reading, it's not just one sense, there's other things involved in reading. And does that make it a more rich experience for the children who are playing with the book? And do we lose that as an adult when we're so prescriptive in what a book should be?
Well, one thing I do with my students is I blindfold them in class, and then I ask them to go to a bookshelf and reach down a book and figure out everything they can about that book without looking at it. And it turns out they can tell a Bible apart from an airport paperback. They can tell a textbook apart from an old telephone book by the sound that the pages make when they rustle, and by the feel of the paper under their fingers. So I think books are always appealing to all of our senses. It's just that the visual is the only sense that rises to the level of conscious awareness.
So as people talk about, they like the smell of those books, right? That's a lot of people say, and I think they sell even a candle somewhere that is the smell of old books, which I think is an interesting scent to have in your house. Maisie, can we talk a little bit about your book? There are a number of issues in it that are a little bit more prescient to what's happening in society today. Part of your story is about enslavement and the forced migration of Africans to other countries, and then the idea of that. Can you talk about how your book came out in March?
Mm-hmm.
So even before the most recent events that have spurred a lot of the recent conversation about Black Lives Matter, I'm sure that that's something that has always been on your mind for a long time. Is there some way that we can look at the historical aspect of your book and apply it to what's happening in society today in America?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like one of the points for, one of the themes that I would try to make in my novel, and it's probably in a lot of Caribbean literature, is just, how the past is not past, and how they're still feeling the reverberations from slavery and from colonialism, like even in the present day. The only difference is for the younger generations of the family, they're not really aware of the history, and they don't know that it's kind of this like ghost haunting their lives, and that it's making a day-to-day impression. So I think, for when we consider what's going on today, it's just another result of, a society that has centered on white supremacy, and it's not, nothing that's happening now hasn't happened before. But I think for a lot of people, they've just never had to think about it before. And the cause has never been, I guess, like, people have been aware of police brutality, but I think the cause hasn't been at the forefront of their minds, which is like white supremacy and anti-Blackness. And those are two kind of issues that I wanted to bring them up because I think sometimes in Caribbean culture, because the Caribbean is like a mostly Black society, people tend to not assume, who are not from there, that they deal with white supremacy. But those ideas have been passed on through time, and are being upheld by people who are Black at some, in most cases. So, that's kind of a major theme of my book. It's just how kind of this legacy of white supremacy and anti-Blackness just continues to impact our lives.
Yeah, and there's part of the book too where one of your characters does a DNA test, just to learn about their family. And I just read an article the other day in Smithsonian Magazine where some researchers have researched DNA and kind of to trace where in Africa and other countries Black people have come from in America, and it was very interesting. And I think as we talk about technology, so technology has I think given more real-time awareness to issues that are happening with police brutality and racism, and it's also given more information about where people are from with our DNA. As a writer of fiction, do you think that technology is going to help us in unraveling these issues, or do you think it's going to hurt?
I think probably both. I think on the one hand, I know that I forgot his name, but I know one scholar is using technology to track the instances of police brutality and to keep a better record of what's really happening, and that's definitely helpful. And what police departments it's happening with, and what populations are being targeted, et cetera. But at the same time, especially with like DNA, I did a DNA test, which was kind of which definitely influenced my book. And, I did it because I was so curious. I think, part of what I got at it in the book is that there are so many unanswered questions, especially in the Caribbean. I think a lot of family structures are very complicated. And so I just wanted more information about myself. So I did it. But at the same time, it's very risky because, you are giving this corporation your information, and you're not really sure what they'll end up doing with it. And I know that Ancestry.com, which is where I did the DNA test, was recently bought by another corporation. I can't remember.
It's a venture it was bought by a very large corporation, and yes.
Yeah, and so it's like now people are advising that people delete their DNA before this other company. But it's like now I had my mom take one too because I want to see. But it opens the door. It answers a lot of questions, but then it leads to a lot of ethical problems at the same time.
Yeah, they're also, I think, I don't want to say tangentially, but parallel to this has been the trend in publishing for own voices books written by people of certain backgrounds, not certain, but books written by people of backgrounds of the characters that they're in versus a white person writing a book about an experience that is not theirs. Is that a trend in America? Have other countries had this discussion or relate to the game in that? as I look at other countries which are fairly diverse, I wonder, is America behind the eight ball on this? Is it something that we are just now coming to the game, or is this a worldwide phenomenon?
I'm not sure. I mean, I think Leah can answer.
No, please go ahead, Macy.
Yeah, I'm really not sure. I would think I would actually think America might be a little ahead of the game in some places. I just know, like, when I've traveled to Europe, I think there are very like racist markers that are still like in effect, and nobody says anything. So I don't know. I think in America, at least, we have a lot of uncomfortable conversations, and I think sometimes in other countries they don't. I don't know. What do you think, Leah?
It's been an issue for a while in Australia and New Zealand. I think for analogous reasons, but I guess I would also think about. I don't know whether you two have seen the recent debate about the Bailey's, the maker of the liqueur, decided to republish books by authors who wrote by female authors who wrote under a male pseudonym under their birth names. And well-intentioned as this was, in a way, it seems like an extremely paternalistic and essentializing gesture, because in some of these cases, George Sand, who's one of the authors who they republished under a female birth name, George Sand wore trousers, and George Eliot, whose works they republished under the name of Marian Evans, wrote very explicitly in her letters, "I want to be known as George Eliot," and the narrator of George Eliot's novels is a male narrator. So that I think these questions about the relation between the author's identity, the name on the cover, and the voice of the author in the book are complicated.
Yeah, and I think one of the issues too is that I think the focus has been, or the message has been reinterpreted to say like, you can't write a book if you're not from the culture of the character that you're writing about. But I don't think that that's really what the issue is. The issue is more that publishing has traditionally valued books written by, written by somebody outside of that culture more than they value books written by somebody inside that culture. And I think that that's the shift that's taking place, is that, publishers are aware that people want to read books, or at least place equal or greater value on those books written by people writing about their culture.
Yeah, and there's been conversation about the whiteness of the publishing industry, right? Which always surprises me, because for the major publishers to be centered in New York City, one of the most diverse cities in the country and perhaps the world, for there to be for the publishing industry to not be that diverse is a little shocking to me.
Yeah, and I tried, actually. That was the first industry I tried to go in when I graduated, and I just couldn't even get an interview. So
yeah, I think that's a larger, different conversation, but I think it has implications here as well, right? We read about people who apply for jobs but put a different name on, and they get interviews with the same exact qualifications. But
yeah, I think there's always this conversation about the requirements too, like, which is to have an internship, and who has the luxury to do an unpaid internship is another.
Yeah, while you're paying for college credit for the internship. Yeah, those are all big issues.
Yeah,
that we are tackling. Yeah. So I want to take a couple of minutes and wrap up here and talk a little bit about just reading and how it's influenced both of your lives, and what do you think the future holds for books and libraries and society as we navigate these new ways of reading and getting information. And you don't have to answer all at once. You can have a conversation about that. But maybe just start with how reading has influenced and impacted your life.
I think for me, growing up, I didn't really have a lot of access to things. You know, so I think for me, reading was like an escape. You know, we were like new immigrants when I was little to this country, and I feel like my family was afraid of everything. And so we were very like, we were very overprotected and kept in a very strict household. So I feel like for me, reading was always like an outlet, and it was always a way to kind of understand the new culture that I was in, even if I wasn't actually interacting with it. You know, and I think, yeah, so I feel like libraries, like I started going to libraries for that exact same reason. And I think a lot of the kids that I work with go to libraries for that same reason too. Like if you're in an urban environment and maybe your parents are a little overprotective and like don't feel like every place is safe, I feel like for most people, libraries are always like the safe zone where, you know, that was the one place I could go without asking permission anytime I wanted to. You know, and I think that role hasn't changed for libraries. You know, and I think while I was there, that was where I could, you know, also a lot of communities don't have bookstores. I didn't grow up in an area with a bookstore. You know, I had to take the subway to go to the nearest one. So that was really the only place where I could access books. And I think for the kids that I work with, it's similar. Yeah, so I think that role hasn't changed. I think the difference is that when I was in high school, I feel like what was interesting was that all the kids would come to the library, like high school kids would come to the library. It was actually, I went to the Jamaica the Queens Central Branch Library, and it was across from this big bus depot. So all the kids, while they were waiting for their bus, would just like swarm in the library. But most kids weren't reading, they were just like socializing. But I remember back then that nobody ever catered to these kids. Nobody ever really cared. Like I read a lot of adult books actually, because I just felt like there was no real section for me as a teen. You know, but I feel like the difference now is that libraries are changing programming so that, you know, you're getting more. You're, in addition to reading, you're getting so much more when you get there, and it's like acknowledging. I feel like the kids back then were treated kind of like as a nuisance, but now they're acknowledging their role as like a, you know, a meeting space for people in the community, which is great. So I think, you know, reading is something that obviously I'm a writer. It's something that it's always going to be important to me, but I think also libraries themselves have evolved so much that they're even more relevant, I think, for the community than they were when I was younger.
Leah, what about you?
I don't think books have influenced my life. I think books are my life. Outside of them, there isn't much there. But I would want to second Maisie's point about the social power of libraries, which has worked at various times in both directions. If you compare libraries in the Jim Crow South, which wouldn't allow the same book to be borrowed by Black and white readers and had all kinds of explanations about why it was dangerous and unhealthy for white readers to handle a page that had been handled by African American readers. And then you think about the potential of the library as a space of inclusion. I love your idea, Maisie, of the library as the one place that you don't need to ask permission to go to. And that seems like a tremendously important aspect of this shared civic space, whether or not people are reading there.
Yeah, I think that really highlights too the importance of libraries, not just a place of books, but it's a place, and people use libraries in different ways for different reasons. And you know, the idea of it as being a quiet place of reading is not what some people want, and that's not what they go to the library for. And so that's a tension we have in library land, is that some people are wistful for the old days of the quiet temple of knowledge, but people use it as a community center, and they learn in different ways, and you know, they need it for different resources and different aspects of learning that maybe 50 years ago would not have been something we thought libraries could provide. So, well, I want to thank both of you for taking the time to talk about your books and libraries and reading. It's been a very fascinating conversation, and I really appreciate your perspectives. I really want to just thank you for sharing your talents in the written word. Both your books are very fascinating and both very different, but I think they highlight the importance of reading in different ways. So thank you very much. And I think we're going to have Katrina come back on and take us away.
Thank you. Oh, you're muted, Katrina.
Or maybe, Katrina, you've muted yourself.
I have, sorry. Too many things on my end. I just was saying thank you so much for coming today to talk to us about the future of reading. It was fascinating to hear about Maisie's book, but also to hear about the history of books and reading and the libraries. It was so interesting. Thank you so much. And we are going to finish now with some look at the I'm just removing and sharing my screen. We're going to have a look at all the sponsors, the festival partners who have helped us to present the festival, the online festival, and all of our sponsors who you can see up on screen, festival friends and our festival patrons and festival staff, everyone who's helped us to put together all of these online events. We thank you so much. We wouldn't have been able to put today on without you, so thank you. Also, we would like to tell you about the next event that's coming up, and that is about gender politics and women breaking boundaries. And that will be on at 2 p.m. So you have a few minutes to go and get a cup of tea or some water. And if you'd like to see all of the events that we're running today, you can have a look on our Crowdcast channel or on our website at www.succeedtogether.org/events. And thank you very much. Have a good afternoon. Thanks.